Our next speaker is Brendan McNally from the UK. Brendan has been active in the animal rights movement for over 30 years and has organized many protests, campaigns and other actions in London and beyond. In today's presentation, Brendan will examine how our own attitudes and behavior as individuals and as a movement can have a better, more positive and more profound influence on those we are trying to reach. Welcome, Brendan.
Just 1 second. Okay, I'm going to have to use notes this time. Like the rest of you, I'm always very busy, and when I first got asked to do this talk, I had a great plan that was going to be a really slick PowerPoint presentation, and I was going to prepare it, and everything was going to be fine. And as usual, I got very busy, and I didn't have time to prepare very well, so I'm going to have to use notes this time, which I don't really like to do. I was recently asked to do a talk about the history of direct action in the animal rights movement, and I was looking back at old archives, press cuttings and footage, going back many years, and in particular I started looking back at footage which involved me about 30 years ago when I first became involved, and I've been involved in all areas of campaigning, from education to demonstrations to hunt sabotage and even illegal direct action. And it's usually this last area of direct action that people remember me for, because that's the exciting part of the movement, and people remember that. But obviously, most of the things I've been involved with have been much more mundane than this. And the direct action is kind of a tiny minority of the activities that I've been involved with. But anyway, starting to look back at the movement as it was 30 years ago, and comparing that with the movement now, I started to see some of the great changes that have taken place. And it's important to say here that I'm talking about the history of the movement in the UK rather than in general. So this is really I'm talking about the way the movement has changed in the UK in the last 30 years. And one thing really hit me very drastically was how the image of the movement has changed in that time, and how the image of the movement has suffered in that time. I'll just tell you a little anecdote. An old friend of mine I met last week, we were discussing, and she, at work, one of her colleagues didn't know she was vegan. And she said, "I can't believe you're vegan." And she said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Because you're so nice." And this was really shocking. And I thought, well, and I looked at this footage from 30 years ago, and I thought, well, how the image of the movement has changed, because 30 years ago, things were so different. We were very popular. We were the Robin Hoods. We were the people everyone looked up to. And this first footage I'm going to show you captures this really. If you listen to the commentary on this documentary, you'll see how sympathetic the commentary is. And I actually appear on this documentary. Right at the beginning of this film, you'll see some people breaking into a laboratory to rescue animals, and I'm the person with the white scarf around my face. But just have a look at this documentary and listen to the sympathetic tone of the narrator.
Somewhere in the country, small groups, mostly young people, are prepared to break the law in guerrilla actions on factory farms, universities, agricultural colleges and laboratories.
And so you saw there the press cuttings where they described the laboratories as animal hell, and the activists are generally given much more sympathetic footage. Have you got that still there? And then there's this one from the newspaper, yeah. And I compared that to the press, to the terrible coverage that we get now in the newspapers. And this is another one that I saw, I dug out. And this was another one that involved me as well. This is a. If you just, can you scroll down to the bottom? This is from the Daily Mirror. So if you zoom out a bit. This is from the second most popular newspaper in the country, the Daily Mirror. Just zoom out a bit. Zoom out. Yeah. Zoom in. So this, and this was an article that appeared about 30 years ago, and this shows a picture of me being whipped on a hunt. And again, the tone of the, if you can zoom into the photo now, the tone of the article is very sympathetic to us. Down a bit, and you can see there the huntsman. I'm being attacked now by the huntsman, and you can see that the arrow there is pointing to the fox, and this is the fox that's just been killed by the hunt. And again, this, because of the coverage of the newspaper, this huntsman was sacked from his job. And again, I bring this up again because compared to the coverage, almost hysterical footage that activists and hunt saboteurs receive nowadays, it's such a big contrast, and that's what got me really thinking, and that's really what this talk's about: is why has our image changed over the years? And I chose these two because they're hunt sabotage and because they involve direct action, because it shows that image is not to do with the use of illegal or direct action. It's something over and above that, because even in those days, even direct action was treated sympathetically in the media. Have you got this slide now? Just the animal thing. The presentation. There we go. Change. We didn't put it on there, did we? So yeah, sorry about this. Not as slick as I wanted it to be. That's the other one. Change, that's it. So yeah, so this is so the question I started asking myself is why has the movement's image become so negative over the years? And then the other thing that hit me as well is that in all that time, really, the movement in the UK has not really grown. In fact, if anything, it's actually smaller. And that's amazing to think that in 30 years we really haven't grown that much. It's grown internationally, and that's great. In fact, it's in many more countries now, and that's fantastic. But why has the movement not really grown in the UK? Lots of new activists, but many activists have dropped out, and why is that? And thirdly, is there a link between these two facts? Of course, one of the obvious reasons for the negative image that we've received has been because, as with all struggles, when you become effective, the vested interests, the companies, the industry, the government and the media will portray your movement as dangerous and extremist. They'll attack your movement. And they did that successfully with animal rights. We were portrayed as, because we were pro-animal, then we must be anti-human. We were portrayed as sociopaths. Somehow we were against humans. And it's true that this propaganda did work to a certain degree. But they do this to other movements. So why in animal rights why was it so effective? And it's important to know this for various reasons. Firstly, so that we as a movement can address it in the UK. Obviously, we need to try to reverse it. And secondly, so that we can provide a lesson so that movements in other countries don't make the same mistakes that we did. So that if you're a movement that's just starting out, and many countries are just starting out, the movement's very new in some countries, so you need to learn from the mistakes that we made so that you don't make the same mistakes that we did. And thirdly, because the negative image that we've got was really the key reason, and many of you will have heard that in the UK we suffer from a lot of repression at the minute, and many people have been sent to prison in the UK for really just for kind of protests. And the reason that they were able to get away with this without a big public uproar about it was because of the negative image, and because we didn't get support from the rest of from the public and from other protest groups. And again, I think this was due to the fact that we'd been isolated because of our negative image. So for these three reasons, it's important to know why we've got this image. And I think one thing I saw quite quickly was how readily some people within our movement were kind of happy to go along with this negative image. We were happy to play up to the stereotype which the media and the government tried to portray us as. The anti-human, the dangerous extremists. For many people, the excitement of doing that, people played up to that, unfortunately. And I think I've noticed a trend over the years that as people get more and more involved in animal rights, I'm afraid there is a section of the movement in animal rights that does become very cynical about humans. And unfortunately, that's a fact of life. Many times, it's just, sometimes it's down to humour. But unfortunately, that does feed into our negative image, and it's something that we have to be aware of. That's stapling, yeah. I think one of the causes of this is our need for a community, and because often when we become vegan campaigners, we often become isolated from our former communities, from our families. And gradually, this is replaced by a community of fellow activists, and that's kind of normal, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's probably a good thing. And it's particularly strong when you're involved in campaigning, because you form bonds with other activists, and you start forming a community, and then you start to see the struggle as a kind of a battle, like a war, and you start to see your fellow activists as comrades in this struggle. And that's, again, in itself, it's nothing wrong with that. But you see, then the human trait then is when you find your community, is you then look for a common enemy that you need to unite the struggle. You need a common enemy to unite your new community. And then you start with the problem of all you have to do then is to defeat the enemy, and then you've won the struggle. And it's a bit more complicated than that. But unfortunately, I think that idea permeates. And so we start developing these enemies, I think, and we start looking around for enemies. And the problem with having an enemy is you then have to develop negative feelings towards your enemy to motivate you. And so you develop anger and hatred towards the enemies that you've built up in order to keep your struggle, your community going. And then I think back to what actually started me really when I first became active, and what starts, I think, nearly everyone when you first become active. And it's not really anger and hatred which gets you going, it's compassion. It's compassion for the suffering of the victims. You see the victims suffering in the labs, you see the victims suffering on the farms, and you want to do something, and you feel compassion. And I think the problem starts there. I think the problem starts when that compassion, you no longer get motivated by compassion, but you then start replacing that with motivation by anger and hatred towards an enemy that you've built up. And so you eventually what started out as a positive motivation has now become a negative motivation. You want to defeat the enemy. And I think that is probably where the problem starts. I think we become fixated on an idea that all we have to do is to defeat a group of people in a battle, and then we're going to win this war. But it's much more complicated than that. I think a lot of people then point to the fact that don't we need anger? We need anger because it will keep us going. We need hatred towards these people because that will keep us going. I don't think so. I think compassion is a much stronger and much more permanent motivator than hatred or anger. And if you look in nature for instance, or even in human society, the people who fight the hardest are the people who are fighting for their family, for the people that they love. And in nature you see that. And so you can see that compassion itself can be a very strong motivator. And I think we need to bear that in mind. Now, before I go any further, I want to make one point clear, that this is not to do with anything to do with philosophy or tactics or anything to do with that at all. So what I'm saying applies to whether you call yourself an abolitionist, a liberationist, animal rights. You could call yourself a pragmatist or even an animal welfareist. Or it doesn't matter about tactics. You can say you believe in only legal methods, or you can say you believe in breaking the law. You can say you're non-violent, or you can say you believe in violence are sometimes legitimate. It's nothing to do with that. As I've said, I've been involved in all sides of campaigning. It's not to do with philosophy or tactics. It's to do with our attitude as a movement, and how our attitude then feeds into how we are perceived by the rest of society, because in the end, we are going to have to persuade the rest of society to support us. And in the UK, I'm afraid that's been a least successful part of our campaign. But of course, in some ways, it is like a battle or a war, in the fact that it requires the same dedication, the same sacrifice, and the same courage and commitment as if we were in a real war. And as you've seen, we have actually suffered some real injuries and some real deaths. In the UK, we've had 3 of our comrades have been killed while they've been trying to fight for the animals. But in other ways, it's very different, and it's these differences that we do need to bear in mind. And I would guess here that virtually none of you, or very few of you, were actually born vegan here. And so for a start, it's very unusual to have a conflict situation where everybody on this side of the conflict starts off on that side of the conflict. So all of us, some of us a few weeks ago, some of us maybe 25, 30 years ago, we were all involved. We were all at one time willing participants in this slaughter. We all have our own, we all have committed the same acts of the people that we're fighting against. So we need to bear that in mind. We were all willing participants. But yet how quickly we start coming to see ourselves as different. And sometimes that difference can be, that seeing ourselves as different can become arrogance. And I think we need to be aware of that. And we need to make sure that we don't start seeing ourselves as superior to those people who have not yet got the message. And I've noticed on some demonstrations how some people have been vegan only a few months, and yet you see them hurling abuse at people for eating meat. And a few months earlier, they were doing exactly the same themselves. Imagine how that looks to the non-activist community. It comes over as arrogant. Those people then are seen as representing the whole community. So we need to be aware of how some people are then viewed by the rest of the community, by the rest of society, as representing the movement in general. And even stranger, I look back at these old press cuttings and I realize that virtually none of those people that were my activist comrades in those days are now active. None of them. Very few. Maybe 1 or 2%. And so the battle lines in this battle are completely changing all the time. Many of those people who were on this side of the battle then are now on the other side. Most of those people have gone back to eating meat and are now part of the problem rather than the solution. And I guess many people here in 30 years' time will probably be the same. There's no reason to think differently. So this idea that there's an us and them, that there's good people and bad people, it doesn't quite, when you look at it like that, it doesn't kind of add up in that way. And furthermore, I guess everybody here has relatives and friends and loved ones, people we actually love that are involved in some way in the mass slaughter. And yet we all conveniently forget this. We forget our relatives and friends when we start drawing our ethical maps. We tend to put people into compartments. And on top of this, even if we do remain active for many years, does anyone really think that it was somehow preordained that we would become the activists and the other people would become the farmers and the vivisectors? Because I don't think so. I think given a different set of circumstances, I could have been if I'd have been born into a fur farming family or a farming family, I could have ended up being a fur farmer. I don't believe there's anything that preordains us to become the good guys and those people to become the bad guys. But So you know, if this is a battle, so who are the enemies in this battle? Who are the enemies in this war? And if we're really honest, it's 99% of the population. And there's 99% of the population who are not vegan. Because if they're not vegan, then they're involved in some way in this mass slaughter, the thing that we're fighting against. But of course, if that's the battle, then that's not very good odds, so we've got a problem. And so in order to deal with this, to keep this analogy going, we create an imaginary division. We say, yes, but there's a difference between the people actually carrying out the killing and the people who are passively consuming the products. But is there really a difference? Where do you draw this convenient line that separates the guilty from the innocent? Is it those who just actually do the killing? What about those who breed and raise the animals? What about those who transport the victims? What about those who work in the shops, work in advertising? And what about those who consume the products of slaughter? See, as the circle gets wider and wider, you start to realize that there's not really a convenient line you can draw to show where the responsibility lies. Okay, I think we do need, for tactical reasons, to break the opposition down into convenient chunks. And we can do that for tactical reasons, but you have to keep remembering that that's only for tactical reasons. That when it comes down to it, there's no difference between the person eating meat and the person wearing the fur coat. If you take a tactical view, then you need to bear in mind all the time that you're taking a tactical view. And it makes no sense for us not to do that, because as I said before, I think if we don't take that wide view, then we are seen as hypocrites and we're seen as arrogant, and we need to avoid that, because that is how we're viewed in the UK now. And if this is a battle if this is a battle, which I think it is in some ways, it's a battle for hearts and minds. It's a war of ideas. And the hearts and the minds that we have to actually reach are the very people who we see as the opposition, as the enemy. Because it's not really a question of defeating anyone in this. It's a question of winning people over to our point of view. And we've got to keep remembering that. It's not about defeating, it's about bringing people around to our way of thinking. And in some ways, we don't have to bring 100% of the people around to our way of thinking, just a critical mass. Some people say that might be 10%, some people say 38%. But it's that battle of hearts and minds that we have to win, and we have to keep remembering that in the end, that we do have to win that battle. So that's the theory, but how does that affect in practice? So if we start looking at some practical examples, because up to now that's just been a theory. So if we look at some practical examples, just make sure I've not got my thing wrong way around. Some practical examples of where I think the problems have come in the movement in the UK. So the angry demonstration, we've all been on demos, haven't we? And you're giving out leaflets on a demonstration, and somebody comes past and they start shouting. You get the hecklers on the demos, don't you? And they say, you know, you're wearing leather shoes. That's a classic one. Or what are you doing for humans? And immediately, so often on demonstrations, I see a crowd of demonstrators turn on the person, and you get an angry mob of people screaming abuse back at the member of the public. Again, that just gives the image of the movement. It's such a negative image, and yet that's what happens almost every time. In that situation, I would say the best thing to do is to remain calm, to stay calm, and to treat those people with calmness and respect, and just to deal with them calmly. No matter how bad they scream at you, you remember that you're in a public space, and everything you do will be viewed by the rest of the public as representing the movement. So you're ambassadors for the movement. So if you're on a demonstration and somebody comes up and abuses you, just take the abuse. Doesn't matter. It's not about you. It's about the animals. Don't feel, if your pride's been hurt because someone says you're wearing leather shoes, stay calm. If somebody says you don't do anything for humans, stay calm. Just explain to them quietly. Let them lose their temper. Don't you lose your temper. Remain calm. That's my advice. Obviously, you can take that advice or not. But so many people over the years, and they still do it now, you see a screaming mob of animal rights people, 8 or 9 will immediately start harassing this person who made one comment. And to be honest, that person wanted that reaction because they had nothing to do that day. They wanted to come along and disrupt the demo. And you've given them the perfect answer, that you've allowed them to disrupt your demo. If you can't stay calm, just ignore them and carry on with what you're doing. Another example is the Balaclava. In direct action, is really a Balaclava necessary? Remember the image of the masked activist with and I've done it myself. I've actually taken pictures wearing a Balaclava. I mean, many of these things I'm talking about now are things which I've done myself over the years. So I'm not saying anything from a position of superiority. These are mistakes that I've made. I've screamed at hecklers as well. I've done all these things. But looking back now, is a Balaclava really necessary? It's really used. You think what a Balaclava represents to the general public? It's a rapist. It's a. I'll come to questions at the end. Yeah, questions at the end. Okay. Oh, Balaclava. It's a mask. The Balaclava. Apologies. Yeah, Balaclava is the black mask that you wear, and the people who are normally associated with those are rapists and bank robbers, and I think. Activists wearing those over the years, I think, has been one of our downsides, and unnecessary, really, as well. So, what about some alternatives, some creativity? In the 1980s, the Northern Animal Liberation League stopped using balaclavas, and they started wearing surgical equipment. So they dressed up as surgeons with the surgeon's mask and the hats. So that's a good alternative. Or animal masks. You could wear animal masks, of cats or even maybe. So it's connected with the animals that you're rescuing. So if you're rescuing dogs, you wear a dog's mask. Something creative. Even a human mask, maybe of a famous politician, something humorous. You see these masks that people wear. These are all alternatives. If you need to hide your identity, you don't need to use a balaclava. You don't need to come over as a dangerous extremist. If you have to use a balaclava because it's nighttime, I can understand that, because obviously if you're wearing something light-coloured, you don't want to be seen for camouflage. But then when it comes to the photo opportunity, you don't need to wear the balaclava then. And that's when the problem becomes, because the balaclava is then used in the photo opportunity. And I'm afraid to say that there is a section of our community that enjoys the macho aspect of wearing the balaclava. And I'm afraid I was one of those people. I admit it. I freely admit that I enjoyed wearing the balaclava. There was something inside me that got a bit of an excitement out of it. But looking back, it did no good for our image. And it was unnecessary. If it was necessary, fair enough, but it wasn't necessary. There were many alternatives. So I would urge people to think about that. Press releases and publicity. What we need in that, we see so many press releases, especially when it comes to direct action, that are arrogant and aggressive. And again, I think one of the... Before I go into this, I'm a Shack supporter. I've been involved with the Shack campaign from the beginning. But I think some of the Shack press releases were very arrogant and didn't help us at all. And I still support Shack now, so I'm not saying anything that I wouldn't say to the people involved in running Shack, as I'm still a Shack activist. But one of their slogans was, "We never give in and we always win." Well, what was the point of saying that? If you're going to win, you don't need to be arrogant about it. And the fact is, we don't always win anyway. We lose sometimes, I'm afraid. The fact of life is that in a social struggle, now and again you lose. It's a fact of life. You win some, you lose some. And unfortunately, some people also give in. I think probably of all the people that said we never give in and we always win, maybe 50% of those people have already given in and they still didn't win. So it's an arrogance, and it's also setting yourself up for a fall. So when you're coming to do press releases, you need to, I think, show some humility and show some understanding. So if for example, if you want a company to go out of business, you want to explain, I think we need to express sympathy that people are losing their jobs. We'd say, well, we don't want people to lose their jobs. We want this we don't want this company to go bankrupt. We want this company to change its business. We don't want the shop to close down. We want them to stop selling fur. So you can change the argument rather than trying to put a negative point across, put a positive point across, but put sympathy across. Make your press releases sound sympathetic to the people that we're fighting against. Because again, if we're seen by the public as being aggressive and unsympathetic, the public do feel sorry for people who lose their jobs because of, and as the society does change towards a more animal-friendly model, then people are going to lose their jobs. And we need to show sympathy for those people, not show aggression and arrogance. And I'm afraid in the UK that we have done that. We have shown, no, we've put this image over that we don't care about people. And I think this has harmed our image. And it's something that you should be aware of in future when in your own struggles, in your own countries. Office invasions, and I can see someone in here who's going to be listening to that one. I wonder sometimes if they're a bit over the top, unnecessarily again. And again, I'm a Shack supporter and I've been involved in an office invasions and I've done some of these things. But I think if you're in an office and six or 12 or 20 activists storm into your office, you don't need to then start screaming at them. I think the shock is already there. They're already going to be shocked. I think rather than starting to let off sirens and screaming slogans, you need to then be creative and say something like, right, everyone stay calm, this is an office invasion, will you all stay calm? Reassure them. Let them know that they're not the people you've come to. You're there to speak to the directors. In the Shack trial, they played some of these office invasions, and you could see on the faces of the judge and the juries how this affected them. They were very shocked by some of the fear on the faces of the employees in the offices. I think if you go into an office, you need to reassure the people there. You need to say to them, look, don't panic. This is an office, this is an occupation. Do a lock-on, maybe lock on with your handcuffs or something like that. But I think maybe stay calm in that situation. Some of the films that they showed at the Shack trials were actually films that were taken by the activists themselves, crazily enough. So again, I think this is not about tactics. I don't have anything against office invasions or against, radical actions. But I think they can all be everything can be presented in a positive light. And so we need to, and in general, with the Shack type campaigning, I think you need to make your tactics proportionate to your target. So if you have a tertiary target, a third somewhere three stages away from the actual abuse, then I think you have to be careful about how extreme your tactics are. And you need to explain to those people why you're developing those tactics. So when you invade an office, you need to explain calmly and clearly to the people in the office, look, this is why we're here. We've not come to hurt you. But if you just go in and start screaming straight away, they don't know what you're going to do. They're going to be terrified. So put people at ease straight away. So reassure them. And also remember that even if you scare some of the people there, for everyone that you scare, everyone that you frighten, somebody there will become more angry and will become more will be emboldened by what you're doing. And somebody in government will become more determined to stop you as well. So in a way, short-term gains are outweighed by long-term damage. And we talk about the fur coat wearers. So again, you're in the street and we see lots of people shouting, scum wearing fur coat. And yet everybody else around that person is wearing leather. And you too wore leather maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So is it really a coherent thing to do to suddenly start screaming abuse and shouting at somebody wearing a fur coat? Isn't it a better thing to do to stay calm, to calmly explain to them why they shouldn't be wearing fur? Maybe give them a leaflet. That's a much better way of doing it. For one reason, it's going to probably be more effective. They're going to listen to you. I would say it would be more an effective way of doing it. And B, it's going to get more sympathy from the people around you. I think it's more important than the person wearing the fur coat are the 100 people who are watching your behaviour, because they see you abuse that person and they think that they are not sympathetic to you then. So again, just think about everything that you do. And those are just some examples. So in general, I would say weigh up what your actions are. And if your actions have to cause some suffering, and sometimes when you're involved in a situation, you have to accept, well, maybe you don't have to. Some people think you don't have to, but if you're in a movement where you think that you have to carry out an action where some people will be affected negatively, then I think it's important that you explain those, and you take into account the negative impact you're having on those people. And how you do that is, those are just some examples. How you do that is up to you. Because as I said before, I think it's a fallacy. It's wrong to think that we can only be driven by anger and hate. I think compassion can be a driver, and it can be the strongest driver, and I think it's the best one. And again, come back to my third one on the board, is why have the movement not grown in that time? Why did many activists drop out? And this feeds into that, really, because I think not only does anger and hatred is not effective in the long run, it actually affects you personally. And it's kind of what you call riding the tiger. It's because these are emotions that you can't control. In fact, you can't really control emotions at all. So if you start becoming motivated by anger and hatred, sooner or later the anger and hatred will start. You can't control when you use it, and that'll start turning it. You'll start turning it on other activists. And I think this is a lot of the reason why in the UK movement, there's a long history now of kind of vicious infighting between people who don't really have much. They don't really have different points of view. But I think the way I strongly suspect that it's the anger and hatred that gets displaced from they're becoming motivated by the anger and hatred, then gets displaced onto their fellow activists. And I think that's what causes a lot of people to drop out. And in fact, it also ends up being displaced and turned on yourself as well. And I think it leads to a lot of anxiety and depression within, because eventually, if you always have those negative feelings inside, then eventually that will affect you. Sooner or later, that will affect you, and it'll affect the people around you. But compassion, on the other hand, can be a real motivation. And if you start throwing compassion around, there's going to be no problem, because nobody's going to be hurt by that. I think one of the people I would like to, just before I finish, to cite in this argument is somebody like Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela took up the armed struggle in 1963 or 1962. But he never lost compassion for the people he was fighting. But he realized in his mind the armed struggle became necessary. But as soon as some 30 years later, when he became president of the country which locked him up for 30 years, the first thing he did was set up a peace and reconciliation committee. And he forgave straight away. He forgave all the people that tortured and killed his people for a century. And if it's good enough for Nelson Mandela, then it's... Thank you. And if it's good enough for Nelson Mandela, it needs to be good enough for us. And the point I'm trying to make is, however you take on this struggle and this fight, remember that we have to keep compassion as the main driver. And compassion, remember that compassion for animals, compassion for, is easy. Compassion for innocent animals like our friend here is easy. It's easy to be compassionate. Compassionate for our friends and our family and our loved ones, that's easy. Everyone can do this. The real difficulty comes in showing compassion for those people who are doing things which you completely disagree with. That's where the difficulty comes. But it's that compassion that we have to keep showing. And unfortunately, that means showing compassion for people who are doing things that we completely disagree with. But in the end, it's a matter of winning these people over. And fight hard, fight strong, but keep compassion in your heart. And that's the only way we're going to win this. And that's all I've got to say now. Thanks. Well, I did have another thing to say, but I'll save that for the questions.
Okay, there's one question right here. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so.
I just wanted to say I come from America and I couldn't agree. We're having the same issues. I've been an activist and involved in this movement for over 28 years. And we're having the same problems in our country. A friend came with me to this very conference. He's not vegan, but he's been supporting the Sea Shepherd and the Hunt Saboteurs financially. He didn't know any better because it's the way he was raised. I wasn't raised vegan. I wasn't brought up vegan. But he was really scared to come to this conference because he didn't know how people were going to treat him. I have to say, the way he has been treated by all of you, I have to applaud you because everybody's been very welcoming and warm to him being here. And I think that that's something that we need to think about. The way that we do, like Brendan said here, the way that we respond and treat people, we're not going to get more numbers on our side or people sympathetic to what we're going against if we act like we're holier than thou and we're better than everybody else, and also that we can't talk to you because you're a meat eater or you're a vegetarian or you're this or that. Everybody starts somewhere, and you have to try to understand where these people came from, and they came from somewhere similar as I did. You know, I wasn't raised vegan, so we're having the same problems in the US, so I appreciate you bringing this up.
Thank you. Do we have a question? Can you two come up here, please?
Hi, Brendan. Thanks for the presentation. I'm very happy that you see the things which I've noticed. I'm very, very new to animal rights, and my journey started in UK. And I have observations like you have. The only thing I disagree is you said you cannot control anger. Yes, you do. You can control anger, and it's not why this is a problem. The problem is because anger burns out people, so you cannot carry on anger too long. But my main comment is why I think UK doesn't get too much support from people. I joined the first march in 2010. I think I told you already, or I told few other people. The first march I went for, I hated it. I went there and there was so much hater. Everyone there was just shouting, meat is murder, meat is murder. I know it. I know it is, but I know it will not help. I've seen the reaction of people on the street. It wasn't sympathetic. People hated us. They didn't want, they didn't even think why we are doing it. They were just thinking, why do we hate everyone? I didn't hate anyone. I said, I will never join it again. Last year, I started thinking about it again, and I said, I didn't do it for these people who went there. I did it for animals. So I joined another march, the same march. The first I joined, it was for farmed animals in 2010, and last year there was another one for farmed animals in Brighton, organized by the same people. And I tried to ask people the same what you asked now, for compassion, because how we can win the hearts is by compassion. The main problem in UK is, how you said, people fight together. And I'm really glad that I came for this conference, because like you, I went for the gathering in UK in August, and after a few minutes I wanted to leave. I wanted to go back home, because people are not friendly. And I know a lot of people in UK who are vegans and who support animal rights, but they do not join for the same reason why I hated my first march. So I think we have to change the attitude. Thank you. I'm sorry for so long.
Okay, thank you. You have a question?
Sure. Okay. So I share your enormous respect for the Shack campaign, mate. And we're really guilty, as you know, of this we never give in and we always win strategy, where we just bang our head on the wall until we win. But what I'd like to ask for you and your opinion on is, how could Shack have done better? Where did Shack go wrong with that hardline militant style that Shack had that smashed these companies? Where were the bits that we should have altered? Where should we have just tempered it a little bit whilst keeping that militancy?
Well, that's it. I think there's very little did wrong. I think the Shack campaign was very successful, and I think bearing in mind that the Shack campaign would have won 3 or 4 times over, the only reason that we didn't win And I was involved in the Shack campaign. I've been a Shack campaigner from the beginning. When the first Shack people went to prison, I was actually one of the people who kept the Shack campaign going, because I went to visit the people in prison and I kept it going for, 2 or 3 of us kept it going for a few years, for a few months until other people turned up. But I think where Shack went wrong, I think, was probably, I think what happened was that just the general tone. I think the tactics were fine, but just the general tone should have been more humility, a bit more sympathy for the victims, for the not the victims, but maybe the people who were affected by them, because what the problem, as I said, was when they came to court, all of these things were shown to the jury and to the judge, and then it lost them sympathy, and I think it could have even affected the reason why they were found guilty and why they were convicted in the end. So I think just generally the tactics were fine, but I think the tone could have been a bit more humility and a bit less of we always win, we never give in, because I think that just comes across as arrogant. And I think more sympathy for the office workers. If you have to invade an office, if you go into an office, then you need to reassure them, you need to let them know that you're not against them, it's just the bosses, it's the company bosses or the company itself. So I think just tinkering with it, just tinkering with it a little bit would be fine. I don't think you need to radically change what you did. And I think if people just take that on board, I think it can make a difference in future as well.
Okay, so we have one more question. He promised, Steve's going to ask a question, he's promised he's going to make it really short because we're almost out of time.
Actually, two short questions. Number one, first of all, it was a great talk, and there's a lot of wisdom.
Thanks,
earned by experience from you, so I definitely applaud that. And we're on the same page, of course, in many ways. But just a couple provocations to you. Number one, how far does this compassion against exploiters extend? Is this a Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King ethic where we're supposed to love thy enemy? Because one of the things Martin Luther King was criticized for in the 1960s was placing an unnecessary, unbearable psychological burden on the oppressed. To love their oppressors is quite a different thing from not hating them or maybe having compassion for what in life has brought them to be, what conditions have brought them to be an oppressor. Number two, on the issue of war, I don't consider non-vegans and enemies, the related discourse. I don't consider non-vegans my enemy. I do consider the corporate military state complex my enemy. How can we see corporations like ExxonMobil as anything but the enemies, not only to us, but to the entire planet and to the future? And one of the things Malcolm X said that was, I think is still quite important, is that if I see an enemy as an enemy, in other words, a corporate military entity, I will not get co-opted or seduced into thinking that they are my friends or that we are in the same framework. We are antithetically opposed to one another in our interests, as Marx said different classes are or should be. Antithetically opposed in what we want and what we're fighting for. Isn't that an enemy?
Yeah, I can only think of one thing at a time, so I'll start with your second one there. You'll have to repeat the first one again. The second one.
The first one is about love.
I'll start with the second one first, because when I started thinking about the second one, I forgot about the first one, because unlike you, I can't think of two things at once. So, the second thing, the complex, the military complex, the industrial. Again, what you're talking about an entity rather than the people, and of course that is the enemy. It's the system, and if you keep in mind that. Everyone, in a way, to a greater or lesser extent, we're all victims of that system. Then, yes, they are the enemy, but the enemy is the system itself. So, yeah, I have no objection with finding an enemy in the system itself. But there's a difference between that and seeing, because again, I go back to what I said before about where are you going to draw this line between? People say, well, there's a difference between. The person who's the head of who's the head of the company and the person who is who's just a vegan and who's not a vegan, they just eat meat. But I still haven't found this convenience dividing line yet. Where do you draw this line? But yeah, but where as I've said before, the line is never. you know, who is, whenever you try and draw that line, then it's very difficult to know which side of, you know, where the line's to be drawn. I've never seen anyone anyone give me a convenient argument.
Brendan?
And the second one was, yes, I'm not sure. I don't think you need to have. I don't think you need to sort of actively have love and compassion for everyone. You don't have love and compassion even for everyone around you. I don't think we need to go into whether you need to actively show compassion towards people. But I think it's about not having that anger and that hatred really towards actual individuals. I don't think I would encourage people to actually show love and compassion for everybody they meet. But I think it's about, if you're being seen as a representative of the movement, then we have to remember that it's not just about you and that person that we're fighting against. It's how that appears to the rest of the people who are looking at that, who are witnessing that interaction. As we interact with the people we consider our opponents, really we've not just got to consider our relationship to those people, but it's also all the people who are watching that interaction. They will then, 30 seconds, they are then affected by that, and it's our image. Then our image is affected. It's our image in the eyes of all these other people that's more important. And so I would say the main thing to do is you can't change everyone all at once. There's a lot of anger and a lot of in this movement. So the best people are going to be starting to wonder now, well, how can I change all these things around me? So I would say the best thing you can do is don't worry too much about changing everything all at once. Lead by example. So if you see behaviour around you that you don't agree with, don't worry about it. Just don't join in. Lead by example, and eventually people will follow you. Just lead by example.